She built an empire in silence while he slept beside his mistress. On Christmas Eve, he handed her a suitcase and told her to disappear. By sunrise, he realized the most catastrophic mistake of his life. If this story already has your pulse racing, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to hurt. The snow didn't fall in Seoul that December. It never did when you needed it to. When the cold deserves something to show for itself, something white and clean to cover the ugliness underneath. Instead, the city got freezing rain, the kind that came down sideways and turned every streetlight into a smear of dirty gold. The kind of rain that soaked through a coat before you realized it had started. Vivian Hale stood at the kitchen window and watched it hit the glass. She had a mug of chamomile in both hands, not because she wanted it, but because her hands needed something to hold. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon. She had hung the wreath herself 3 weeks ago, had wrapped the banister in ribbon while the kids argued over where to put the angel on the tree. She had done all of it. She always did all of it. The clock above the stove read 1:47 a.m. She heard the garage door before she heard the car. That low mechanical groan, the one she had memorized in the first year of marriage, back when she used to feel something in her chest at the sound of it. Relief, anticipation, something that had been named love at the time. Now she felt nothing. Or not nothing. She felt her fingers tighten around the mug, which was the body's honest version of nothing. Dante's headlight swept the kitchen wall. She heard him cut the engine, heard the door slam with more force than necessary. He always did that when he'd been drinking, like the car had wronged him somehow and needed to know it. She heard his footsteps on the stone path, then the front door opening with the particular sound of a man who no longer believes he needs to be quiet in his own home. She didn't turn from the window. He came into the kitchen with his coat still on, which meant he wasn't planning to stay long in this room, which meant something had already been decided before he walked through the door. She knew him well enough to read his silhouettes. 8 years of marriage had made her fluent in the language of his body. He smelled like Selena. Not perfume exactly. Selena was too smart to wear anything that obvious. It was subtler than that. The particular warmth of someone else's skin under a man's collar. A heat that didn't belong to the cold he'd just walked in from. Vivian had learned to identify it the way you learn to identify a gas leak. Quietly, precisely, without making a scene about it. "You're still up," Dante said. "I'm still up." He went to the cabinet, poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass he'd used this morning for orange juice and hadn't bothered to rinse. That detail, the unwashed glass, felt like a kind of summary of what their life had become. "Kids are in bed," she said, since someone had to say something. "I know." He drank. She watched his reflection in the window, that angular face she had once studied the way people study paintings they think they love, looking for meaning in every line. The jaw. The dark eyes that his mother called Korean and his father had called cold. I was 41 now and had started carrying it in his shoulders, some invisible weight that made him stand like a man braced for impact at all times. He set the glass down. "I want a divorce," he said. The rain hit the window. Vivian did not move. She let the words land the way they needed to. Not like a blow, because she'd been expecting something like this long enough that her body had stopped flinching at the anticipation of it. The words sat there in the kitchen between the pine smell and the cinnamon and the dirty glass, and she breathed through them, slow and even. "Okay," she said. He'd expected something else. She could tell because he shifted his weight, a barely perceptible recalibration, like a man who'd rehearsed a scene only to find his scene partner had different lines. "It's over, Vivian. I've been trying to figure out how to—" He stopped, started again. "I need you to leave. Tonight. Tonight." She finally turned from the window. She looked at him the way she'd been practicing for almost 2 years, which was calmly, with her face arranged into a kind of neutral steadiness that she'd worked very hard to build and that had cost her more than she would ever tell anyone. She studied him for a moment. This man who ran the Eastern distribution network for one of the most powerful crime syndicates in Korea, who could make a phone call that ended careers or started wars, who had been photographed twice by Interpol and never charged with anything. And she thought about how small he looked in their kitchen at 2 a.m. "Tonight," she said, "on Christmas Eve. I know what night it is. The children are asleep. I know. You want me to wake them? I want you to be gone by morning. He said it without raising his voice, which was how she knew he meant it completely. Dante Moretti didn't shout when he was serious. Shouting was for men who needed to convince themselves. Take a suitcase. I'll have the rest of your things sent wherever you end up. There'll be money for... I don't want your money. A pause. Everyone wants money. Tell me where you'd like me to take the children, she said, since you've planned this so carefully. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She didn't think Dante was capable of the specific biology of guilt anymore. Something more like impatience, the look of a man being made to confront a logistical problem he'd hoped to avoid. They stay here. You know that. I know that's what you'd prefer. It's not about preference. They're my children. They're also mine. Vivian, his voice dropped. That was the warning register, low even, the voice he used with employees who pushed back once too often. Don't make this something it doesn't have to be. She looked at him for another moment. Then she set down her mug, crossed the kitchen, and went upstairs. She did not cry. She was very careful about that. She went to Mia's room first. Her daughter was 7 years old and slept with her arms thrown wide like she was trying to catch something in her sleep, mouth slightly open, hair a dark tangle across the pillow. Vivian stood in the doorway for a count of 10, just breathing, just looking at the small shape of her daughter in the glow of the nightlight. Then she went to Eli's room. Her son was 5. He slept curled on his side with both fists tucked under his chin, so small it still surprised her sometimes. The compactness of a child's sleeping body, how completely they surrender to unconsciousness. She watched him breathe. Then she went to the master bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the closet shelf, and started packing. She was efficient about it. She'd thought about this more than once, not obsessively, not with the manic energy of someone fantasizing about escape, but practically, the way you think about a fire evacuation plan. What mattered? What could be replaced? She took her passport and the children's passports from the lockbox in the top drawer. She took 2 weeks of clothes for herself and from the children's rooms, enough for a week. She took the small box of photographs from her nightstand, real photographs, printed and kept, an old habit, and her laptop. She took nothing that had been given to her by the Moretti family. She had thought about that distinction for a long time and had been careful about it. She carried the suitcase downstairs. Dante was still in the kitchen. He'd poured more scotch. He watched her come down the stairs, and he watched her set the suitcase by the front door, and his face did the thing it always did when something happened that he hadn't anticipated, which was to go very still and very careful. "You're taking the kids," he said. "I'm not leaving my children in this house tonight." I said, "I heard what you said." She picked up her coat from the rack by the door. "You said to be gone by morning. It's not morning." "Vivian, if you want to argue custody, you can call your lawyers." She pulled on her coat, buttoned it methodically, top to bottom. "I'll have mine respond." He set down his glass. He straightened up to his full height, 6'2", broad in the shoulders, with the particular physical authority of a man who had spent his life making other people feel small. "You don't have a lawyer." She looked at him. She went back upstairs and woke the children. Mia woke the way she always did, immediately and completely, sitting up with her eyes wide and her brain already running. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. We're going on a little trip." "Now?" "Right now." Mia looked past her at the dark hallway. "Where's Daddy?" "Downstairs. Daddy's staying home." She held out Mia's coat. "Put this on over your pajamas." Eli barely woke. She carried him, heavy and warm and unconscious, his head on her shoulder, his breath slow against her neck. She got them both downstairs. She picked up her suitcase with one hand, still holding Eli with the other arm, and she opened the front door. Dante was standing in the hall. He'd moved without her hearing him, a thing he was good at. That quality of sudden proximity that had impressed her once and frightened her later, and now simply was what it was. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Where are you going to go?" "Don't worry about that. You have no family here. You have nothing. Dante." She said his name quietly, with Eli asleep on her shoulder and Mia standing at her side with her coat buttoned wrong and her eyes going back and forth between her parents with the calculating alertness of a child who has learned to read the temperature of a room. "We're leaving now." She walked past him and through the door. The rain hit her immediately, cold and hard, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your chin. Eli stirred but didn't wake. She got them to the car. Her car. A black SUV registered in a name that would mean nothing to Dante's people for reasons she had worked very carefully to arrange. And she buckled Eli into his seat and helped Mia with her belt, and she loaded the suitcase into the back, and she got in, and she started the engine. The garage door opened. She looked at the house through the rain-smeared windshield. All the windows lit, the wreath on the door, the lights she'd strung along the roofline still blinking their slow green and white. A beautiful house. She had spent years making it beautiful. She thought about the morning she'd found the first hotel receipt. Not looking for it, just finding it. The way you find things when you're putting laundry away, and a coat pocket gives up something it was keeping. She thought about standing in the bedroom that morning with the receipt in her hand and the particular quality of silence that had filled the room. She thought about what she had decided, in that silence, about what she was going to do. She put the car in reverse. Dante came out without a coat. He stood in the rain at the end of the stone path, and he watched her back out of the driveway, and there was an expression on his face she didn't think she'd ever seen on him before. Not regret. Something adjacent to it. The look of a man who has just thrown something away and is only now asking himself what exactly he held. She stopped the car. She rolled down the window. He came to the driver's side and stood there in the rain with it hitting his coat and his hair, and she looked up at him from inside the warm car, and she said, with no particular emphasis, no theatrics, no tremor in her voice at all, "Check your mailbox tomorrow morning. Your mother deserves to know the truth before she decides to blame me." He stared at her. "Merry Christmas, Dante." She rolled up the window and drove away. In the rearview mirror, she watched him stand at the end of the driveway in the rain, getting smaller. She drove south. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the wipers going, and Eli asleep in the back seat and Mia quiet beside him, watching the city pass outside the window with her coat still buttoned wrong. The streets of Seoul at 2 in the morning had a particular quality, emptied out, all the neon smearing in the wet, the Han River somewhere to the south of them with its lights and its black water. Vivian drove through it like she'd driven this route 100 times, because she had. Not literally. But she had driven it in her head, in the small hours of mornings when Dante was elsewhere and the house was quiet and she sat at her laptop doing the work she'd told no one about. She had mapped every route. She had thought through every problem. She had done it the way she did most things in her life, which was carefully, thoroughly, and without any expectation of help. "Mama?" Mia said. "Yeah." "Where are we really going?" Vivian glanced in the rear view. Her daughter was watching her, not frightened, just assessing. 7 years old and already assessing. She had gotten that from Vivian, that watchfulness, though Vivian had never decided whether it was something to be proud of or something to grieve. "Somewhere good," Vivian said. "Is it far?" "Not far." She reached over and turned on the radio, low, something instrumental and slow. Mia seemed to accept this. She turned back to the window. Vivian crossed the bridge into Gangnam at 2:15. The neighborhood changed in the way it always did south of the river. The buildings taller, the lights harder, the streets wider and cleaner with that specific quality of money that has decided it no longer needs to justify itself. She drove past the towers and the hotel facades and the high-end retail that sat dark and waiting behind its glass, and she turned off the main road onto a smaller one, and then smaller again, and then she came to a gate. The gate was black iron, 12 feet tall, set between 2 stone pillars with cameras she had selected herself mounted at each top corner. She pressed the remote on the visor and the gate swung inward without sound. The driveway was long and curved, lined with bare trees that in spring would be thick with something. She'd bought the house in late autumn and had not yet seen it in the other seasons. She pulled up to the front entrance and stopped the car and sat for a moment with the engine running and looked at the house. It was large. That was the first and plainest thing to say about it. It was large in the way that specific kind of wealth announces itself. Not ostentatiously, not with the desperate glitter of new money trying to prove something, but with the settled confidence of stone and glass and proportions that had been thought through by someone who understood that real luxury is restraint applied at tremendous expense. 3 stories of steel-framed glass and pale limestone, terraced gardens dropping away to the south, a view of the city that on a clear night would be unobstructed from the Han all the way to Namsan. She had paid $40 million for it. She had paid for it with her own money. She sat in the driveway and let that fact rest in her chest for a moment. Not with pride exactly, or not only with pride. With something that felt more like the exhale at the end of a very long breath held for a very long time. She got out and got the children. Eli didn't wake. She carried him to the front door and keyed in the code, and the door opened into the entry hall, which was warm. She had the heat running, had set it before she drove to the other house tonight, had thought about this particular detail because Eli ran cold, and she'd wanted this to feel like coming home and not like arriving at a strange place in the middle of the night. Mia stepped inside and stopped. She looked up as at the ceiling, which was high and open, at the staircase curving up from the entry, at the light she'd had installed at low warmth, at the view of the city through the south-facing glass, all of it dark and shimmering in the rain. "This is ours?" Mia asked. "This is ours." Her daughter looked at her for a moment. Something passed through her face, complicated, too complicated for 7. But then Mia had always been too complicated for whatever age she was. Then she said, "Okay," and walked further inside. Vivian took the children upstairs. She'd had the rooms furnished, not elaborately, but carefully, with things she'd chosen herself over the past several months, and had delivered during the weeks Dante was traveling, which he did frequently, and with the relaxed confidence of a man who doesn't imagine his wife has anywhere interesting to go. Mia's room was pale green and had a window seat. Eli's was smaller and had a shelf along one wall that she'd lined with books. She put Eli down and covered him and stood in the doorway watching him not wake up. Then she went to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She sat with her face in her hands and breathed and felt the shape of the last several hours move through her. And then she sat up straight again and picked up her phone. One message. From a contact saved as N. "You okay?" She typed back. "We're here." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Told you, sleep. Everything's already done." She set the phone down. She looked at the window, at the rain running down the glass, at the city lights beyond it, all that wet illumination. Somewhere across the river was the house she had lived in for 6 years, the wreath she had hung, the man standing in his driveway in the rain with the expression on his face she had never seen before. She thought about the mailbox. She had placed the envelope there herself 2 days ago, timed carefully. She had thought about the timing for months, not the content, which had been assembled over the better part of 2 years, but the timing, which was everything. She'd needed Dante to make the first move. She'd needed to be gone before he understood what was happening. She'd needed his mother to receive the envelope on Christmas morning with the specific weight of the holiday around it, when family means the most, and the betrayal of it cuts the deepest. Margaret Moretti. 73 years old, physically small, possessed of a will so concentrated it seemed almost to have mass. The woman who had built the American Korean network from a dry cleaning operation in Koreatown in the 1980s and had handed it to her son when she turned 60 and had regretted some version of that decision ever since, though she would never say so. The woman who had welcomed Vivian into the family with the particular warmth of someone making a calculated investment. The woman who, in Vivian's careful reading of her, loved her son with the specific anguish of a person who sees clearly what they've created. The envelope contained photographs, hotel records, flight manifests, a timeline assembled with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years being very patient and very quiet in a house full of secrets. It named Selena Voss with documentation. It was not emotional. It contained no commentary, no accusations, no appeal to sympathy. It simply presented facts organized chronologically in Vivian's own careful hand on the cover page. For Margaret. So that the truth is yours before anyone else's version of it reaches you. She had spent a long time on that sentence. She lay back on the bed without undressing. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the morning 2 years ago when she had found the hotel receipt and stood in the bedroom and heard the silence of her own life and made a decision. Not the dramatic kind of decision. Not the kind that feels like a declaration, like a line being crossed. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into your body like a new temperature and changes the way you breathe, permanently. And from that point forward, you are simply a different person than you were before, though no one around you knows it yet. She thought about Naomi. Naomi Cross had been her college roommate at NYU, a small, sharp-tongued woman from Chicago who had gone on to become one of the most respected private wealth strategists in East Asia, which meant she moved money in ways that were invisible and legal and extremely difficult to trace for anyone not specifically looking for them. Vivian had called her 14 months ago. She had not explained everything because she hadn't needed to. Naomi had a quality that had always made Vivian feel she was not alone in rooms she was actually alone in. She understood things before they were fully said. "You need to build something they can't see," Naomi had said, the first time Vivian had laid it out for her. Not a question. "Yes." "From scratch? Or you have a start?" "I have a start." She had described the translation work, freelance, supplemental. She'd been doing it for 3 years, mostly legal documents and technical contracts, for a rate that Dante had never bothered to ask about because he'd never considered it worth asking about. She had described the savings she'd built from it, the account under her maiden name at a bank she'd opened before they were married and had never closed. Naomi had been quiet for a moment. Then, "How much time do you have?" "I don't know, less than I'd like." "Okay, I know someone. Evelyn Brooks. She's in Seoul. She does private family law, but she's got a finance background and she's discreet in the way that costs something. You're going to need her before any of this goes further." Evelyn Brooks had turned out to be a compact woman in her late 40s who wore very plain clothes and very expensive shoes and had a way of speaking that was so precise it felt almost surgical. She had sat across from Vivian at a coffee shop in Mapo, not the kind of place anyone from Dante's world would be, and she had listened without interruption for 40 minutes while Vivian laid out her situation. Then she had asked 3 questions, each one landing in exactly the place that mattered. Then she had ordered another coffee and said, "You understand that once we begin this, the structure has to be airtight before he gets any indication that you've been doing anything at all. The moment he suspects, his people will start looking. So we're not just protecting assets, we're protecting the absence of assets, the impression of absence. He has to keep believing you have nothing." "He already believes that," Vivian said. Evelyn looked at her over the coffee cup. Something moved briefly in her expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition. "Good," she said. "That's what we're working with." Over the following months, Vivian had learned to think in structures. She had learned what a blind trust was and how to fund one. She had learned about holding companies and beneficial ownership and the specific geography of financial privacy. She had learned it the way she'd learned everything in her life, which was completely and without letting it show. The biotech investment had been Naomi's. She had framed it carefully, laid out the risk clearly, and Vivian had put in an amount that represented everything she had at that point, and had then spent 3 weeks not sleeping properly while she waited to see what would happen. What happened was a Phase 2 trial result that the market had not expected, and the share price did something that Vivian had not allowed herself to expect either. She had sold half at the peak and used it to fund the next stage of what Evelyn called the structure. The house had come last. She had been shown 17 properties before this one, each time with a different broker, none of them knowing they were dealing with the same buyer, a precaution Evelyn had recommended. The first time she had walked through the gates of this property, in September, on a morning when the sky was that particular autumn blue that Seoul produces for about a week a year, she had stood in the driveway and looked at the house and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She had felt like herself. She had signed the purchase documents under a holding company whose beneficial owner was a trust, whose trustee was a law firm in Singapore. It was legal. Every dollar was documented. Evelyn had gone over it 3 times, and then hired a second attorney to go over it again, and then sat across from Vivian and said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has built something that will hold under pressure, "He can try. He'll find nothing he can touch." Vivian stared at the ceiling of her bedroom, in her house, and felt the exhaustion of 2 years settling into her body like something physical, like the aftermath of a long run. She thought about Dante standing in the driveway. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she'd said, "Your mother deserves to know the truth." That flicker behind his eyes, that adjustment, the first moment he'd had to consider, just briefly, that something was happening that he didn't understand. She thought about him waking up tomorrow morning. She thought about him going to the mailbox. She thought about what he would understand, in stages, over the coming hours, as Christmas arrived and his mother opened an envelope, and the world he had built, on the assumption that Vivian had nowhere to go and nothing to go, began to reveal itself as something that had always been, from a certain angle, a story about a woman waiting. She was asleep before she finished the thought, In the morning, Eli climbed into her bed at 6:15 and pressed his cold feet against her legs, and she woke up gasping, and he laughed. That full-body laugh he had, the one that came from somewhere below language. And she pulled him close and lay there with his small ribs under her arm and listened to the rain. It had slowed. It was barely rain anymore, more like the idea of rain, the city still wet with it, but the sky beginning to change. She could see it through the window, the first gray suggestion of something lighter coming from the east. Her phone was on the nightstand. It had been silent all night, which meant either Dante hadn't gone to the mailbox yet, or he had and hadn't processed it yet, or he had and was doing the thing he did when something hit him hard, which was to go very quiet and very still before he moved. She lay there with Eli breathing beside her and waited. At 8:43, a message came through from a number she had blocked 8 months ago on her personal phone, but which she maintained on a second device for exactly this kind of monitoring. The message read, "We need to talk. Call me." She didn't answer. At 9:17, "Vivian, I mean it. Call me now." She set the phone face down. At 10:04, from a different number. One of his lieutenants, she recognized the last 4 digits. "Mr. Moretti is asking you to contact him." She picked up her personal phone and called Evelyn. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "How are you?" "Fine, it started." "I know. I got a call from his family's legal representation at 9:30. A pause. "They're asking about marital assets." "What did you tell them?" "That I'd need to review any specific requests in writing. I was very polite." Another pause, and Vivian could hear the particular satisfaction in Evelyn's voice, carefully contained but present. "He doesn't know what he's looking for yet, but he knows something is wrong. He'll figure it out soon. Let him. Everything is where it needs to be." Evelyn's voice shifted into the register she used for facts that needed to land clearly. "Vivian, when he comes, and he will come, you need to be ready to be very calm." "I know. Calmer than you think you need to be." "Evelyn." "Yes. I've been calm for 2 years. A beat." "I know you have," Evelyn said. "I'll be there by noon." Vivian hung up. She looked out the window at the city. The rain had stopped. The sky was still overcast, but there was light coming through it now, that pale winter light that doesn't warm anything but makes everything visible. She could see the line of Gangnam's skyline to the south and the glint of something, a window catching the first real light of the morning. She got up. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and scrambled eggs, and she called Mia for breakfast. Her daughter came downstairs in pajamas and sat at the kitchen counter and looked around at the kitchen with its clean lines and its unfamiliar space, and she said, with the tone of someone taking inventory, "Do we have a Christmas tree?" "Not yet." "Are we going to get one?" "Today, if you want." Mia considered this. "Okay," she said. She picked up her fork. "Is Daddy going to come here?" Vivian poured the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of her. She thought about how to answer this, about the many ways you can tell a 7-year-old a true thing without giving her more of the truth than she needs right now. "Eventually," she said. Mia nodded. She ate. Vivian stood at the counter with her coffee and watched her daughter eat eggs in the kitchen of the house she had built from nothing while her husband slept next to his mistress. And she felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything she had a clean word for. It was larger than those words. It was the feeling of having done, finally, what you decided 2 years ago you were going to do, and of finding yourself, this morning, still standing. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Margaret Moretti. She set down her coffee. She breathed. She looked at Mia, who was not paying attention, fully absorbed in her breakfast, and she stepped around the corner into the hallway, and she answered. "Good morning, Margaret," she said. The old woman's voice, when it came, was very quiet and very controlled, and had beneath it a quality that Vivian recognized as the sound of someone holding something enormous in very tight hands. "I received your envelope," Margaret said. "I know." "How long?" "The affair? Almost 3 years that I know of, possibly longer." A pause. "The photographs are from the last 2. I have more documentation if you need it." Silence. The long kind. "Where are you?" Margaret asked. "Somewhere safe. The children are with me." He said. She stopped. Started again. "He told me you left on your own." "I did leave on my own," Vivian said. "He asked me to." Another silence, longer. Then, Vivian. The old woman's voice had changed, stripped of something, quieter. I want you to understand something. All right? I don't know yet what I'm going to do with this, with him. A pause. But I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever Dante decides to do in the next few days, when he realizes, I will not be behind it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Vivian understood exactly what she was telling her. She understood it completely. Yes, she said. Thank you, Margaret. The call ended. She stood in the hallway of her house with the phone in her hand. From the kitchen came the sound of Mia asking about orange juice. From upstairs came the beginning of Eli waking up, that particular progression of sounds. First the movement, then the silence of him sitting up and figuring out where he was, then the footsteps. Her phone buzzed. A message from the blocked number. She looked at it on the secondary device. I know about the house. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and went to get her son from the top of the stairs, because he was 5 and didn't know where he was, and she didn't want him to be afraid. Not today. Not in this house that she had built to be the kind of place where he wouldn't have to be. She was halfway up the stairs when the second message came through. Vivian, I don't know what you think you've done, but this isn't over. Not by a long way. She looked at the message. She thought about the man who had sent it, standing in whatever room he was in right now. His office, his bedroom, the kitchen where she'd stood last night at 2 in the morning watching rain hit the glass. She thought about the expression on his face at the end of the driveway. She put the phone in her pocket and went up to get her son. Behind her, in the kitchen, Mia said, Mama, can we really get a Christmas tree today? And Dante Moretti, across the river, was only just beginning to understand what he had thrown away. Dante Moretti had not slept. He had tried, the way a man tries something he already knows won't work. Lying flat on his back in the dark, with his eyes open and his jaw clenched, and the ceiling above him doing nothing useful. He had been in the study since 4 in the morning, when the scotch had stopped taking the edge off and started making things sharper instead, which was the opposite of what he needed. The house was quiet, in a way it had never been quiet before. He had lived in this house for 6 years, and it had always had noise in it, the specific noise of children and of a woman who moved through rooms with purpose, who set things down on counters, who ran water in the kitchen at odd hours, who breathed and existed in the way that another person's existence fills the spaces of a house without you noticing it's filling them until it stops. He noticed it now. The absence had a texture. It was heavier than silence. He sat at his desk with the photographs spread across the surface and looked at them the way you look at something you're trying to find the flaw in, the angle that makes it mean something other than what it means. There was no such angle. The photographs were clear and professionally composed and had timestamps in the corner that were precise and damning. He recognized the hotel in 3 of them, the Park Hyatt, the one he used when he needed a room that wouldn't ask questions, and he recognized himself, though some part of him kept performing the absurd exercise of trying not to. He recognized Selena's profile, her shoulder, her hair. He put the photographs face down. He picked up his phone. He had called Selena at 7:30, and she had answered on the 4th ring with her voice still blurred with sleep, and the conversation had lasted 4 minutes, during which he had not said the things he'd meant to say because he was still processing what was happening, and he needed more information before he could. He put the phone down. He called Jinho. Jinho Park was 36 years old and had been with Dante for 11 years, which was long enough that he occupied the category of trusted in a way that only a handful of people did. He was the only person Dante employed who was permitted to tell him things he didn't want to hear, a permission he exercised carefully and without emotion. He arrived at the house at 9:15 with 2 coffees from a place Dante didn't recognize, and the look of a man who had already assessed the situation and was organizing his assessment in order of usefulness. He came into the study. He looked at the photographs face down on the desk. He did not comment on them. Tell me about the house, Dante said. Jinho set a coffee in front of him. 40 million, USD, closed last October. He paused. Title held by a Singaporean firm. 3 steps removed from the buyer of record. Dante looked at him. How many steps to get to her? We got there. It took until this morning. He sat down across the desk. The holding company's beneficial owner is a trust. Trustee is a law firm in Singapore. But the trust grantor, the person who funded it originally, is trackable through the subscription documents if you know what to look for. It's her. There's no question. $40 million. Yes. Dante picked up the coffee, set it down without drinking. She had a freelance thing. Translation. It paid. I don't know what it paid. Not 40 million. Jinho said it without inflection, which was the most damning way it could be said. We pulled the tax filings she's made independently. The freelance income was real, but it's not where this came from. He put a folder on the desk. There's a biotech position from 14 months ago, initial investment of roughly 900,000. She sold half at peak. The position returned about 11 times the entry price. Dante opened the folder, looked at the numbers. Where did she get 900,000 to invest? Savings? Over 3 years. She was collecting income and not spending it. A pause. The account it came from is in her maiden name, Hale. She opened it before you were married. It was never disclosed as a marital asset. The study was very quiet. She was planning this, Dante said. She was preparing. There's a distinction, maybe. Jinho watched him carefully. The preparation started, as far as we can trace, about 2 years ago. That's when she engaged the attorney. Who? Evelyn Brooks. Private family law, Seoul. Strong finance background. Discreet. He said the last word the way you say a word that means something more than it literally means. She's good, Dante. What Brooks built around those assets is going to be very hard to challenge. It was all done with Vivian's own money, earned before and during the marriage, documented and clean. There's no Mafia money in any of it. She was specific about that. Dante looked at the folder. He looked at the window. Outside, the Christmas morning had produced some thin and reluctant sunlight that was doing very little for the garden, which looked gray and stripped and cold. My mother called you, he said. It wasn't a question. She called me at 8:40. She told me to find out where Vivian was and whether the children were safe. That was her exact phrasing. Jinho paused. She was not in a good mood. No. He picked up his coffee this time and drank it. It was too hot. He didn't care. She say anything else? She said to tell you she wants to see you. Today. Her words were... He paused again, choosing something. She said, tell him to when he's ready to be honest with me. Not before. Dante said nothing. You should go, Jinho said. I know I should go. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the garden. What's Vivian's move here? Walk me through what she's doing. Jinho was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man ordering things. She's not hiding. The house is registered. The address is findable. She's not running. He paused. She left the envelope for your mother before she left here. She's already moved the children into a stable residence. She has legal representation in place, and her assets are already protected. Another pause. She's waiting. For what? For you to do something that makes her position stronger. Dante turned from the window. Jinho met his eyes. Everything she's done so far is defensive. She hasn't attacked. She's given your mother information. She's positioned herself legally, but she hasn't gone public. She hasn't contacted the organization's other families. She hasn't used anything against you directly. A beat. She's waiting to see what you do next. Whatever you do next is going to determine what she does with the rest of what she has. What rest? What does she have? Jinho's expression shifted, just slightly. That's what I don't know yet, and that's the part that concerns me. Dante stood in his study on Christmas morning and thought about his wife, his ex-wife, or the woman in the process of becoming his ex-wife, a distinction that felt slippery right now. Driving south across the Han River at 2 in the morning with their children asleep in the back seat and $40 million of her own money waiting for her on the other side. He thought about the years of dinners and school events and holidays and the way she had always been present in those scenes with a quality he'd registered as simple and unambitious and had never once examined more closely. He thought about the hotel receipt she must have found. He thought about what she had done with what she'd found, instead of what he would have done, which was either confront or leave or burn something down. She had waited. She had built. She had been, all this time, doing something. He felt something he didn't have a clean name for. It sat in his chest in the region where contempt usually lived, But it wasn't contempt. It was something that recognized itself in something it hadn't expected to find. "I'm going to my mother's," he said. Jinho nodded. "I'll keep working on the asset picture and find out what else she has. I don't care how." Jinho stood. He picked up his coffee, already moving toward the door. Then he stopped. He said without turning, "Dante, you should know. I've worked for you a long time. I know you have. What I'm telling you is that what she built, the structure, the timing, the patience of it." He stopped. "I've seen our people work less carefully, significantly less." He left it there and walked out. Dante picked up the photographs from his desk. He held them for a moment. Then he put them in the folder and put the folder in the drawer and locked it, which was pointless, and he knew it was pointless, and he did it anyway. Margaret Moretti lived in a house in Hanam-dong that she had purchased 20 years ago and had not significantly altered since, because she was of the opinion that things that worked should be left alone, a principle she applied to houses and to people with equal firmness. She was small and upright and white-haired, and she opened the door herself, which she always did, because she had never trusted anyone else to do it, which was one of the many ways in which she and her son were, underneath everything, the same. She looked at him in the doorway. She did not say, "Come in immediately." She looked at him for a moment first, which was its own form of communication, and then she stepped aside. The living room had tea already. She sat in her usual chair and he sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a moment, which between them had never been awkward because they were people who had learned to use silence deliberately. "How long?" she said. Exactly what she'd said to Vivian, though Dante didn't know that. "Margaret, how long, Dante?" He put his elbows on his knees. He looked at his hands. 3 years. She absorbed this. Her face did not change in any visible way, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted, became denser. And Vivian knew. Apparently for 2. Apparently. She said the word with precision. "You didn't know what your own wife knew." "No." While she was preparing, she glanced at something on the table beside her. He recognized the edge of photographs and looked away. "While she was doing all of this quietly, inside your own house, you didn't see it." "I didn't see it, because you weren't looking." She picked up her tea. She drank. She set it down. "Because you were somewhere else." He didn't answer that. "She called me," Margaret said. "This morning, early." He looked up. She was very composed. "She told me the children were safe. She told me the address. She gave it to me freely, Dante. Nobody had to find it. She just gave it to me." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that means? She gave me the address because she's not afraid of what I'll do. She gave it to me because she's already thought about every move and she's decided there's nothing I can do to hurt her from that position." A pause. "She is right. I'm not going to hurt Vivian." "I didn't think you were. I'm talking about legally, financially, in terms of the organization's ability to exert pressure." She held his eyes. "She's untouchable, Dante. Everything she has is clean and documented and built with her own hands. There is nothing for our attorneys to find because there is nothing there that belongs to us." A pause. "She made certain of that, very deliberately, over a very long time." He leaned back. He put one hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. "The children," he said. "What about them?" I need to see them." "Then call her and ask." The old woman's voice was very flat. "You don't get to demand access to your children at 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve and then expect that the word demand still works for you." She set down her tea. "You threw her out of her house, Dante." "It was, I'm not asking you to defend it. I'm telling you what you did." She stood, which she did slowly now, the deliberateness of age, and she walked to the window and stood with her back to him. "I built this family. I built what we have from nothing. I did it with a great deal that was not. I did it through methods that required certain sacrifices, certain compromises." She paused. "I am not naive about what we are. I have never been naive about it. But I built it on the understanding that within the family, within our own walls, we maintained something, a standard, a code." She turned. "You broke it, and she knew it, and she waited until she was strong enough that it didn't matter anymore." He looked at his mother. "She's smarter than you gave her credit for," Margaret said. "It wasn't kind. It wasn't cruel. It was simply accurate. And I think somewhere in you, you knew that. And you took advantage of the fact that she loved you to assume she'd remain manageable. She sat back down. She remained quiet. Those are not the same thing. He had nothing to say to that. You're going to respect whatever the court decides about the children, she said. You're going to go through the proper process. You are not going to send anyone to that house. You are not going to use the organization's resources to put pressure on her attorneys. She looked at him steadily. Are we clear? You don't give me orders. No, she agreed. But you will do this anyway, because you know I'm right, and because you know that if you go at her with what we have, she will use whatever she's holding in reserve, and you don't know what that is. She paused. Do you know what she has, Dante? All of it? A beat. No, he said. She nodded, as if this confirmed something. Then you're going to be careful. He drove back across the river at noon. His phone had 6 messages from Selena, which he didn't open. It had 2 from his attorney, which he forwarded to Jin-ho. It had one from Jin-ho himself, time-stamped 11:50, that read, Call me when you're done. Found something. He pulled over on the bridge. Below him the Han was gray and wide and moving. He called. Jin-ho answered immediately. She has financial records. I know she has financial records. We've been over, not hers, yours. A pause, precise and weighted. Our accountants flagged it when I asked them to look at the overlap between her documentation timeline and our internal records. She was accessing something, Dante. 2 years ago, possibly longer. Certain transaction summaries, the kind that would be in files she had legitimate access to from her time managing the household accounts. Another pause. She's careful. There's nothing that should have given her direct access to anything sensitive, but some of those household accounts overlapped with distributions, with timing that would tell a story to someone who was paying attention. He stopped. Tell me what story. That some of what moves through the organization isn't what it's declared to be. On paper. He said it the way you say something you don't want to say. It's not proof, but in the hands of the right person, with the right context, it's leverage, Dante said. Yes. He stared at the river. A barge was moving under the bridge, slow and gray against the gray water. She hasn't used it, Jin-ho said. Whatever she has. She gave your mother photographs of you and Selena. That's personal. She's kept the other things separate. A beat. Which means she's either saving it or she's choosing not to use it at all, and I don't know which. What's your read? A longer pause. She's not trying to destroy you. If she were, she would have already gone to someone who could use what she has. His voice was careful. But she's not above using it if you give her a reason to. Dante sat on the bridge with the engine running and the river below him moving in that slow, indifferent way that rivers move. And he thought about Vivian standing in the rain last night with Eli asleep on her shoulder and Mia watching from behind her with her coat buttoned wrong. And he thought about what she'd said before she drove away. Your mother deserves to know the truth. And how he'd heard it as a threat, and how he now understood it was more than a threat. It was a demonstration. It was the first move in a set of moves she had been preparing long enough that she'd had time to make them unhurried and clean. He had given her the timetable she needed. He had thrown her out. She had been waiting for him to throw her out. He had walked straight into the exit she had built for herself and called it his decision. There's one more thing, Jin-ho said. What? Selena called our office this morning. Not you. The office. She asked for a meeting. Another beat, this one with a different quality. She asked about the property holdings in Busan. Dante went very still. What property holdings? That's what I'm trying to understand. He pressed the phone against his ear hard enough to hurt. Jin-ho. I know. If Selena has been, I know. I'm looking. His voice was steady in the way that steadiness is a choice. But Dante, if she's been talking to someone, if she's had access to things she shouldn't have, and Vivian found evidence of that, and Vivian has been holding it, he stopped. Let the geometry of it land. Then it's not just your marriage that Vivian was documenting. And the question isn't just what your wife knows about you. On the bridge above the Han River on Christmas Day, Dante Moretti understood for the first time and with complete clarity that he had not ended his marriage last night. He had started something he didn't yet know the shape of, and his wife, the woman he'd handed a suitcase and pointed at the rain, had known its shape for longer than he could calculate, and the woman he'd spent 3 years in hotel rooms with might have been the reason she'd had to. He sat with that for 3 seconds. 5. The barge passed under him and came out the other side and kept moving south. Find out everything, he said. Today. Already working on it, Jinho said, and the line went dead. Jinho called back at 3:47 in the afternoon. Dante was at his desk when the call came in, not working, just sitting in the posture of a man who has been waiting for something and has passed through impatience into a kind of flat, cold readiness on the other side of it. He had spent the hours since the bridge doing the things that needed doing, speaking to his attorney, reviewing the framework of what Evelyn Brooks had built around Vivian's assets, making the calls that established what leverage he had and what leverage he didn't. The answer to the second category was longer than he'd expected it to be. Every door he tried opened onto another locked door, each one more precisely sealed than the last, each one with the fingerprints of a woman who had spent 2 years imagining exactly this afternoon and preparing for it accordingly. He had a specific feeling he'd had only a few times in his adult life, each time at the beginning of a situation that had not yet shown him its full shape. It was not fear. It was the feeling that preceded fear, the recognition that you are in something larger than what you can see from where you are standing. He picked up on the first ring. Talk to me, he said. Jinho's voice was careful in a way that was different from his usual careful, more deliberate, more spaced. The Busan properties, he said. The ones Selena asked about this morning. What about them? They're not in the portfolio where they should be. A pause. 3 commercial parcels in Jung-gu. Combined assessed value, around 8 million. They were transferred out of the Moretti holding structure 14 months ago. Another pause. The transfer was authorized by someone with access to the secondary signatory account. That account has 2 authorized signatories. He stopped. Me, Dante said. And Selena. He had given Selena secondary signatory access 18 months ago. It had been practical at the time. She managed the nightclub. The nightclub ran certain cash operations that needed flexibility. Flexibility required a level of financial access that didn't require Dante to sign off on every movement. He had considered it a convenience. He was now understanding it as something else entirely. She moved them into a shell, Jinho said. Korean registered, single director. The director is a name I didn't recognize, so I ran it against our known associates. A beat. It came back clean. So I ran it against the opposition families. It came back clean there too. He paused. Then I ran it against a broader law enforcement database. The name appears once, in a sealed deposition from a federal inquiry into financial crimes filed in the Southern District of New York 18 months ago. Dante's hand tightened on the phone. The deposition relates to a series of transactions connected to the Hwan network, Jinho said, the Hwan family in Busan. They've been competing for our distribution channels in the South for 4 years. We've had 3 incidents with them in the last 2 years alone. The Hwan network. Dante had spent 8 months running a strategic containment operation against them, had spent money and time and 2 of his most trusted intermediaries negotiating the territorial lines that kept things from escalating into something that couldn't be walked back. He had done all of that while Selena had been sitting in his bed and signing documents with his name on them, and moving his assets into a shell company controlled by the enemy that had been trying to dismantle him. How long? He said. I don't know yet. The first transfer I can find is 14 months ago, but the relationship between Selena and the Hwan-connected director is harder to trace. She's been careful. He paused. Almost as careful as your wife. Dante stood up from the desk. He didn't go anywhere. He just stood, because sitting suddenly felt like something he couldn't do. He walked to the window, the same window he'd stood at this morning looking at the garden, and he stood there again now with the phone at his ear and the garden still gray and cold outside. She was playing me, he said. Not a question, not surprise exactly, the flat statement of a man arriving at a destination he didn't choose. It looks that way. Yes. For the Hwans. That's the working theory. I need more time to confirm the depth of it. Jinho's voice shifted. Dante. If Vivian found evidence of this, the Selena-Hwan connection, not just the affair, and if she's been holding it, then what she has is not just personal leverage, it's organizational. It implicates the network's southern operations. It would have federal implications, potentially, if it reached the right people. The room was very quiet. She hasn't used it, Dante said. No. Why? Jinho was quiet for long enough that it meant he had a thought he was deciding whether to say. Because using it against you isn't her goal, he said finally. I think she would use it to protect herself if you threatened her, or to protect the children. But she's not trying to dismantle the organization. She never was. A pause. She was trying to get out. Dante stood at the window. The thin winter light was going now, the sky shifting toward the gray-blue of a late December afternoon, and the city beyond the garden was starting to show its lights, all of Gangnam warming up across the river. Get Selena in a room, he said. She'll come. Tell her it's about the Busan parcels, and I'm willing to discuss a settlement. She'll come. He paused. Tonight. Dante. Tonight, Jinho. A silence. I'll make the call, Jinho said. He hung up. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 3 days, because he had been telling himself there was time, and now there was considerably less of it. Vivian answered on the third ring. Her voice was even, which he'd expected. She sounded like she'd been doing something ordinary. There was noise in the background, a child's voice, the specific ambient warmth of a house where people are living. Dante, she said, I need to see the kids. A pause. Brief, measured. When? Tomorrow. I can come to... He stopped. He had been about to say wherever you are, and then remembered that he knew exactly where she was, and that she had given the address to his mother voluntarily, and that this too was a message. I can come to the house. Another pause, longer. He heard her move through a room, away from the background noise, and the ambiance shifted to something quieter. You found out about Selena, she said. Not the affair. The other thing. He went very still. The Busan transfers, she said. You know. How long have you known? 14 months, give or take a week. Her voice didn't change. It was the voice of someone who had lived with a piece of information long enough to become comfortable in the same room with it. I found an anomaly in the household account records. I wasn't looking for it, but when I found it, I started looking. A pause. I had a forensic accountant review the pattern, someone Evelyn trusted. He identified the shell structure and traced the director's name. The rest took about 6 weeks. Dante sat down on the edge of the desk. He sat because his legs had made a decision about this that he hadn't authorized. You had evidence that my mistress was working for the Huans, he said, for over a year, and you said nothing. What would you have done with it? Her tone was not rhetorical. It was genuinely curious. You would have confronted her. She would have known you knew. Everything she had access to would have moved before you could secure it. And you... She paused. You were not going to believe me, Dante. I was your wife. You had already decided what category I belonged to. Information coming from me would have been filtered through that. He thought about it. He didn't want to, but he did. And the thought had the particular unpleasantness of being accurate. You protected the network, he said. You found something that could have... You sat on evidence of an internal compromise for over a year to protect an organization you had every reason to want to burn down. I protected my children's father, she said quietly. Not the network. I don't care about the network. A beat. And I needed to be out before any of it came apart. If I had told you and it had gone sideways, if the Huans had moved against you and things escalated... She stopped. Mia and Eli were in that house. I needed them out first. The room was very quiet around him. Not the same quiet as this morning. This quiet had a different weight. Something in it that he recognized as having been assembled from things he had thrown away without examining them. Come tomorrow, Vivian said. 10 in this morning. You can see them. A pause. Bring your attorney if you want. Evelyn will be here. Vivian. And Dante. Her voice didn't harden. It simply became more exact, like a lens brought into focus. Whatever you're about to do with Selena tonight, be careful. If she knows you've connected the Busan transfers, she may move. She has contacts we don't fully know about. A pause. I can send Evelyn's accountant's full report to Jinho. It would give him more to work with. He stared at the floor. The expensive floor of the study of the house that was his, and that tonight felt like a stage set, a construction of a life that had been hollow in ways he had been the last to understand. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Help me." "Because those are my children's assets too, eventually. And because the Juans getting control of the southern operations is bad for everyone." She paused. "And because I'm not trying to destroy you, Dante. I never was. I was trying to survive you." She ended the call. Selena Voss arrived at the Itaewon meeting point at 9:15. It was a private room above a Korean barbecue restaurant that Dante used for conversations that needed to be off-site and off-record. Not glamorous, which was intentional, because glamorous places had eyes. She came in wearing a black coat and her face arranged into the expression she wore when she was managing something, which was a kind of bright, controlled presentability that Dante had once read as confidence and now read as performance. She looked at him. She looked at Jinho standing near the door. She looked at the third person in the room, a compact man named Cho, who handled internal security and had a face that communicated nothing at all times. Her expression didn't break. That was the thing about Selena. She had extraordinary control of her surface. He had admired it. He had thought it was poise. "Dante," she said, "you said you wanted to discuss a settlement on the Busan properties." "Sit down, Selena." She sat. She kept her coat on. Her hands were in her lap and very still, which was its own kind of information. He put a folder on the table. He didn't open it. He just put it there and let her look at the cover, which had the shell company name printed on it. Her eyes moved to the folder. Back to him. "I don't know what that is," she said. "You do." "Dante, if there's been some kind of accounting error with the Busan parcels, I'm happy to—" "Young-soo Min," he said. The name landed. He watched it land. Watched the exact shape of what it did to her face. Not guilt, because Selena was past guilt, but a recalibration, a rapid internal adjustment, the kind a person makes when a situation has shifted faster than they planned for. "I don't know that name," she said. "He's the director of the company you transferred $8 million of my assets into." He kept his voice flat. He had decided before she arrived that he was not going to be emotional about this. That emotion was a resource he could not afford to spend right now. "He's connected to the Juan network. You've been connected to him for longer than I've been able to confirm yet, but my people are still working on that." He paused. "So we're going to sit here and you're going to tell me the parts they haven't found yet, because they will find them. You can choose whether that happens before or after this conversation." Selena looked at him for a long moment. She had brown eyes with a quality he'd always thought of as deep, as if there were something behind them worth finding. He now understood that what was behind them was simply more management, more surface. "It wasn't personal," she said. "Tell me anyway." She unclenched her hands. She put them flat on the table, a gesture of, not surrender, but of someone deciding to stop spending energy on a story that isn't working. "The Juans approached me 2 years ago, before you and I were—" She paused. "Before what we had became what it became. They recruited you before you were involved with me." "Yes." "And then you got involved with me anyway." She held his eyes. "It was useful. To them and to me." She said it without flinching, which he supposed was a kind of honesty. "I'm not going to pretend it was something it wasn't. You'd see through it." Jinho had not moved from his position near the door. Cho had not moved either. The room had the specific stillness of a situation that has been contained but is not yet resolved, the way a fire can look like it's out while something underneath is still burning. "What did you give them?" Dante said, "besides the property transfers?" She looked at the folder on the table, then at him. "Operational timing on the Inchin shipments. 2 of them. Last spring." He thought about last spring. He thought about the 2 Inchin shipments that had experienced what his people had characterized as random customs delays, which had cost him 3 weeks and a significant sum in rebrokering. He had investigated and found nothing actionable. Now he understood why he'd found nothing actionable. "The timing on my meetings with the Zhang family," she continued. 3 meetings. I gave them the dates and the Zhang representative's name." She paused. "And the Busan transfers, which you already know about." Dante leaned back in his chair. He was very calm. The calm had a specific physical character, like cold water, like something that started at the base of his neck and moved outward. He recognized it as the calm that preceded decisions that couldn't be undone, and he was careful with it, the way you're careful with something that could become fire. The Jiang meetings, he said. She nodded. 3 months ago, the Jiang representative withdrew from our negotiation. No explanation. It took 8 weeks and significant concessions to rebuild the relationship. He paused. That was you. Yes. And the inch and delays cost me... He stopped. The number that came to mind was precise. He didn't say it out loud. How much did they pay you? She told him. The number was not small. It was also not large enough, in his assessment, for what she had given them, which told him either she had undervalued herself or she had wanted something else from the arrangement that money didn't cover. He thought about which. He thought about Selena over the last 3 years. The things she'd said about the Juan family in passing, small references he'd registered as general industry knowledge. The awareness that any nightclub operator in Seoul developed about the major organizations in their territories. She had been conducting a course in his operations while lying in his bed. One more question, he said. She waited. Did Vivian know about this part? The operational information, not just the property transfers. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not remorse, but something adjacent to surprise, the look of someone encountering an unexpected variable. I don't know, she said. I don't know what your wife knows. She paused. She was always very quiet, in the background. I underestimated that. Most people did, he said. He stood up. He nodded at Cho. He looked at Selena one more time, at the beautiful managed surface of her, the coat, the controlled hands, the brown eyes that had always been looking at something behind him. And he felt nothing that resembled what he'd felt for the past 3 years when he looked at her. What he felt was a clean and total absence, like a room emptied of furniture. You're not going anywhere, he said. Cho will explain the parameters. He walked out. In the car, driving nowhere in particular for the first 5 minutes, just moving because he needed the sensation of movement, he called Jin-ho. She confirmed the Jiang meeting leaks and the Incheon interference, he said, and the Busan transfers. She was recruited before we were involved. I know, Jin-ho said. Something in that, the flatness of it, the lack of surprise. You know? I've been looking for the last 6 hours. There's more, Dante. A pause. The Juan network has been using the intelligence she provided to build a case. Not an internal case, a legal one. They have an attorney in the Southern District with federal contacts. The Incheon interference, the Jiang leak. She was providing documentation, not just information. They were building a file. Dante gripped the steering wheel. There's a sealed inquiry, Jin-ho said. Has been for 4 months. Our name is in it. The organizational structure, the distribution network, dates, amounts. He paused. Someone built that case from the inside. Someone who had access to our household account records, who could see the distribution patterns, who had signatory authority on a secondary account. Another pause. Selena had all of that. But Dante, there are documents in the inquiry that describe internal operations in a level of detail that's beyond what Selena could have seen from her position. The car filled with silence. Someone else was feeding information, Dante said. Someone who had access to the household finances at a level Selena didn't. A beat. Someone who had been in the house for years, who managed the accounts, who saw everything and said nothing and left before the inquiry became active. Jin-ho's voice was very careful now. I'm not saying it was her. The timing doesn't fully... Don't, Dante said. Dante, don't say it. The city moved past the windows. The lights of Seoul at 9:30 at night. All that illumination running in the rain-wet streets. The towers lit from within against a sky the color of bruised metal. He drove through it without seeing it, with the information Jin-ho had given him sitting in his chest like something that had been swallowed wrong. Vivian had offered to send the forensic accountant's report to Jin-ho. She had offered it voluntarily. She had called it helping him. She had framed it as protecting the children's eventual interests and as a reasonable strategic gesture from a woman who wasn't trying to destroy him. Or she had offered it because she knew that Jin-ho was already finding what was in it and sending it herself, controlling the delivery, controlling the framing, was the move of someone who understood that you cannot stop a revelation, but you can shape how it arrives. He pulled over on a street he didn't recognize. He sat with the engine running and the heater blowing and the city outside doing what cities do, which is continue, regardless of anything that happens inside the small sealed compartments of the cars moving through it. He thought about Vivian standing at the kitchen window at 2 in the morning with her chamomile tea in her coat and the particular quality of her stillness, which he had read for 8 years as passivity, and which he now understood had been something else entirely, something that had been quietly recording everything it witnessed and filing it away in a place he had never thought to look because he had never once believed she was looking back. He thought about the documents in the federal inquiry. He thought about 2 years of preparation, about the forensic accountant, about Evelyn Brooks and Naomi Cross, and $40 million assembled in silence while he slept in hotel rooms with a woman who was simultaneously dismantling him from a different direction. He thought about what it meant that his wife had known about Selena's connection to the Juans for 14 months and had said nothing. Not to him, not to his mother, not to anyone he could identify. It was possible she had held it to protect the children. It was possible she had held it because releasing it prematurely would have disrupted her own exit. It was possible, and this was the thought that settled hardest, the one that had the most weight and the least comfort, that she had been assembling something that went beyond personal protection. That the documentation she had, the patterns she'd observed in the household accounts, the forensic accountant's report, the 2 years of watching distribution cycles move through numbers she had never been supposed to understand, that all of it had been building towards something she hadn't yet deployed. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was one he didn't recognize. Seoul area code, but not a number in his contacts. He almost didn't answer. He answered. The voice on the other end was male, accented with the particular flatness of a man whose English was professional rather than native. And it said his name once, and then it said, "Mr. Moretti, I think we should talk about what your wife gave us before she left." The voice on the phone was patient in the way that people are patient when they already have what they need and are simply waiting for you to understand that. "Who is this?" Dante said. "My name isn't important. What's important is that I have documents your wife provided to a third party before she vacated your residence. Documents describing cash flow patterns through the Moretti household accounts over a period of approximately 3 years. A pause, perfectly timed. I think you know what patterns I'm referring to." Dante said nothing. The engine was still running. The heat was still blowing. Outside the window, a couple walked past on the wet sidewalk, close together under one umbrella, and disappeared around the corner without looking at the car. "I'm not calling to threaten you," the voice said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm calling because the situation has become more complicated than any of us anticipated, and there may be an arrangement that addresses that complexity." "An arrangement," Dante said. "The documents currently in my possession constitute a significant liability for your organization. They also, I'll be honest with you, constitute a liability for certain of our operations that are referenced in them. Operations your wife apparently tracked through the account overlap. She was very thorough." A pause. "She was in fact more thorough than Selena, which is either impressive or alarming depending on your perspective." Dante's jaw tightened. "You're Juan." "I represent certain interests, yes." "And Vivian gave you documents." "She provided documentation to a neutral intermediary approximately 6 weeks ago, with conditions attached." The voice paused. "She did not give them to us directly. She gave them to someone she trusted, with instructions that they be held in escrow and released only under specific circumstances." "What circumstances?" "If she or her children were threatened. If any action were taken against her assets or legal standing by your organization or any affiliated party. If she were, in her words, and I'm quoting her, made to disappear from this situation by any means other than a court order." Another pause, unhurried. "She built a dead man's switch, Mr. Moretti. Except she's not dead, and she had the foresight to arm it before she left." The street outside was empty now, just the wet pavement and the smear of lights. "So why are you calling me?" Dante said. "If she's holding the trigger." "Because the intermediary she used was not as neutral as she believed." A beat, and for the first time the voice had something underneath it. Not nervousness, but the controlled quality of someone managing a variable they didn't introduce. "The person she entrusted with the escrow is known to us, and he made a copy before fulfilling his obligation to her." A longer pause. "We now have the documents regardless of whether her conditions are triggered." Dante understood the shape of it then, all at once. The way you understand a room when the lights come on. Not gradually, but completely. Every corner visible at the same moment. Vivian's safety net had been cut. She didn't know it yet. He sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, something happened in his chest that was not loyalty, and was not love, and was not the residue of either, but was something more animal than both. The specific alarm that fires when something you have damaged is now in danger from a direction other than you. "What do you want?" he said. "A meeting. Tomorrow. You and whoever handles your organizational security. We discuss the document situation and arrive at a framework that is mutually beneficial." The voice was smooth again, the brief roughness of the intermediary revelation already smoothed back over. "And you don't contact your wife tonight. You let her sleep. She'll learn what's happened through the proper channels. And if I don't come, then the documents reach the federal inquiry, which is already open, and you spend the next 3 years managing a legal situation that will cost you considerably more than the Busan parcels." A pause. "And your wife's escrowed evidence becomes evidence in a case that bears her name as the originating source, which creates a different kind of problem for her." Dante ended the call. He sat for 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then he called Jinho. Jinho answered immediately, which meant he had been waiting. "I heard," Jinho said, before Dante could speak. "The call was flagged. Our monitoring picked up the number 2 minutes ago. I've been running it. And it's a burner, but the call routed through a relay we've seen before, connected to the Huan Network's legal liaison office." A pause. "Dante, if they have the documents, they have copies. The originals are still in escrow." He paused. "Or they were. I need to know who the intermediary is." Vivian used someone she trusted. She gave documents to a neutral third party 6 weeks ago. Find out who. Find out tonight. I don't care what it takes. He put the car in gear. "And Jinho. She doesn't know the escrow has been compromised. She doesn't know any of this. Are you going to tell her?" He drove. "Are you going to tell her?" Jinho asked again. "I'm going to the house," Dante said. "Tonight. It's almost 10 o'clock. I know what time it is." He drove south. He crossed the river at the same bridge where he'd stopped that morning. It felt like longer ago than that, like the morning existed in a different accounting of time than the night. And he came into Gangnam moving too fast through streets that were mostly empty and wet and lit with the particular indifference of a city that does not organize itself around individual catastrophes. He turned onto the smaller road and then smaller again and came to the black iron gates. He stopped outside them. He didn't have the code. He hadn't expected to need it tonight. He sat outside the gate of his wife's house at 10 in the evening, and the irony of his position was not lost on him, and he felt it like a physical thing, like pressure at the base of the skull. He pressed the intercom. Silence for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "Dante." Her voice through the speaker, flat and precise. "I need to talk to you, tonight. It can't wait." Another silence. Then the gate swung inward. She met him at the front door. She was still dressed. He noticed that, the fact that she hadn't gone to bed, that she was in the same clothes she'd presumably been in all day. Dark pants, a gray sweater, her hair loose, no shoes. She looked at him with the particular expression she'd been wearing since last night, that neutral steadiness, but there was something slightly different in it now, a question underneath the surface. "The kids are asleep," she said. She said it first, before anything else, which told him she was already in the mode of protecting what mattered most to her regardless of what was coming. "Good." He stepped inside. She let him. The entry hall was warm and smelled like something cooking. She'd made dinner, he realized. She'd made dinner for her children in her house, and the evidence of it was in the smell. And he felt something about that he didn't have the bandwidth to examine. "We need to talk about the escrow." She went very still. It was different from her usual stillness. This was involuntary. The stillness of a body reacting to a word it wasn't ready to hear from this particular mouth in this particular place. "Come in," she said. They went to a sitting room off the main hall. She sat. He didn't. He stood near the window because he had been sitting all day, and right now his body needed the option of movement, needed to feel like it could go somewhere if necessary. He looked at the room, at the careful, clean furnishing of it, at the evidence of children in the corner, a small pile of books, a drawing on the coffee table that he recognized as Mia's because she always drew the same house with the same tree. And he kept his eyes moving because looking at any one thing too long was a problem right now. "Who did you give the documents to?" he said. She looked at him. Her hands were in her lap still. "How do you know about the escrow?" "Someone called me an hour ago, representing the Juan network." He watched her face as he said it. "They have copies, Vivian. The intermediary made copies before he completed the transfer. Whatever safety net you built, it's been compromised." The stillness lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then she breathed, a single slow breath through her nose. And he watched her absorb the information and process it in real time. Watched her face do the thing it apparently did when reality deviated from the plan, which was to get slightly more focused rather than less. It wasn't what he'd expected, which told him something about how little he'd understood the architecture of her. "Park Jae-won," she said, "the intermediary. He's an attorney. He was referred to me by someone I trusted." She paused. "Apparently the referral was not as clean as I thought. When did you give him the documents?" 6 weeks ago, before everything was finalized. I wanted the trigger in place before I moved the children." She was quiet for a moment. "He swore to me the conditions were absolute, that nothing would be released unless I activated it. He made a copy first, he sold it. He said it without softening it because there was no version of this that was soft. The Juans have what you put in escrow." She put one hand over her mouth. Not in distress, or not only in distress, in the gesture of someone who is doing rapid calculation and needs a moment of stillness for it. Her eyes were moving slightly, the way eyes move when a person is running through implications. "They can't use it publicly," she said after a moment. "If they release it, they expose themselves. The organizational references in those documents implicate the Juan network as much as they implicate yours. Selena was feeding them information from inside your operation, but the payment structures, the shell company, that's all traceable back to them." She paused. "It's mutually assured exposure. They know that. They're not threatening to release it publicly. They want a meeting, a framework." He watched her. "They're using it as leverage to negotiate, with me." She was quiet. "And they said—" He stopped. He didn't want to say the next part, and he said it anyway because she needed to hear it. "They said if I don't meet with them, the documents reach the federal inquiry with your name as the originating source." She looked up at him. "They're going to use you as the liability," he said. "If I don't play along, you become the person who fed information to a criminal network's legal team. Even if it came through a compromised intermediary, even if you never intended it to reach them, you're the one whose name is attached to the origination." She stood up. She walked to the window, a mirror of every time he'd stood at a window today, and she looked out at the garden and the city beyond it, all that illumination at 11 at night, all that distance. "He wants the meeting tomorrow," Dante said. "Don't go." He blinked. "What?" "Don't go to the meeting." She turned from the window. Her voice had changed, not in volume, but in texture. The careful neutrality stripped back to something underneath it, something more direct and more urgent. "If you go, you legitimize the leverage. You confirm they have something you're afraid of, and they will use that confirmation to extract concessions that won't stop with one meeting." She held his eyes. "I've spent 2 years watching how you operate, how your world operates. You don't negotiate with someone holding a gun unless the gun isn't loaded, and right now we don't know what else they have." "We." The word landed between them. She heard it. He watched her hear it. Something moved across her face. Complicated, layered, not simple. "The children have both your names," she said quietly. "What happens to you has consequences I can't fully insulate them from. That's not sentiment. It's arithmetic." She paused. "And if my name goes into a federal inquiry, it doesn't matter how clean my assets are. The legal fight alone would consume— I know what it would consume." She turned back to the window. "I need to reach Park Jae-won tonight. If I can establish what exactly he copied and who he gave it to, we know the full scope. Whether they have everything or just the account patterns." She paused. "There's one piece I kept back. I didn't give Chaewon everything. I kept the original Selena Juan connection, the documentation of her recruitment, the timeline. That never went into escrow." He absorbed this. "Where is it?" "Here." She touched the side of her head. "And backed up in a place that isn't connected to any account or server your people or the Juans have had access to. She looked at him. The recruitment timeline, the dates, the payments from the Juan network to Selena before she was involved with you. If that goes to the right attorney, not the federal inquiry, but the right private counsel with specific investigative authority, it undoes the foundation of their leverage. Because if Selena was compromised before she came to you, the Juans recruited her to get to you. They're the predicate offense, not a response to one. Dante stared at her. They came after you first, she said. Everything that followed, Selena, the property transfers, the operational leaks. It was an attack, not an exploit. And I have the documentation that proves the sequence. She held his eyes. Which means your attorneys can argue that any intelligence passed to them through Selena was obtained through their own criminal conspiracy. The documents in their possession are fruit of their own offense. She paused. It doesn't make the federal inquiry disappear, but it changes the posture of it, completely. The room was very quiet. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. I've been thinking about this for 14 months. There was no pride in it. It was the voice of someone stating an accurate fact. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. I hoped once I was out, it would stay contained and everyone would leave me alone. She looked at him steadily. No one is leaving me alone. He turned away from her. He walked the length of the room and turned back, the physical version of a thought that needed space. His phone was in his pocket, and it had not stopped buzzing for the last hour. Jinho and his attorneys, and 2 other numbers he hadn't answered. And the weight of all of it, Selena, the Juans, the inquiry, the meeting tomorrow, Vivian standing in her window with 14 months of careful documentation in her head, and one piece of it still intact, pressed in from all sides simultaneously. If I use what you have, he said, if I take the Selena recruitment timeline to private counsel and build a posture around it, it has to come from me, my attorneys, my filing. He paused. Your name stays out of it. Yes. And in exchange? No exchange. She said it immediately and flatly. There's no transaction here. I'm telling you because it helps both of us and because the alternative is worse for my children. She paused. But Dante, the moment I hand you this, it's the last time. Whatever I know, whatever I've been holding, you get it tonight and it's done. After this, we go through attorneys for everything. For the children, for the divorce, for all of it. She held his eyes. Are we clear on that? Clear, he said. She crossed to a cabinet on the far wall, one of those low built-ins that the house had along one side of the room, and she opened a drawer and removed what appeared to be a standard external drive, the small kind, matte black and ordinary looking. She held it for a moment. He watched her holding it and understood that she was doing something she hadn't fully expected to do, making a decision that was irreversible in the way that not all decisions are, that had a specific weight to it, the way giving someone a thing you have held carefully for a long time always has weight. She held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it from her hand. Their fingers didn't touch. He looked at the drive in his palm, unremarkable, smaller than his fist. Everything on there, he said? The Selena recruitment, payment records, communication summaries that Selena didn't know were logged. She paused. And one other file. Don't open it tonight. Give it to your attorney in the morning and let them read it first and brief you. She looked at him. It's not about the Juans. He looked up from the drive. She held his eyes without blinking. It's about Selena and what she accessed before the property transfers. The operational information, Incheon, the Jang meetings. She paused. There's a third party, someone inside your organization who confirmed what she was pulling out. She wasn't working alone on that side of it. A beat. Your attorney needs to see it before you do, so that the response is legal and documented. If you see it first, you'll make a decision that... She stopped. That what? She looked at him. That you won't be able to come back from, she said quietly. His hand closed around the drive. Somewhere above them, in the quiet of the upper floor, one of the children moved, the sound of small feet on wood, a door, then silence again. Both of them heard it, and neither of them moved for a moment, held by it, by the fact of those 2 small people sleeping above this conversation that had been building for 2 years, and had now arrived at this room on this night, with everything changed and nothing yet resolved. Go home, Dante, Vivian said. Call your attorney tonight. Have him there when you open that file in the morning. He looked at her one more time. At the woman who had stood at a kitchen window at 2 in the morning and watched the rain, who had packed a suitcase in 20 minutes after 8 years, who had driven across a river with their children asleep in the back and $40 million of her own making waiting on the other side, who had held a piece of evidence for 14 months like a stone in a closed fist, not as a weapon, but as the last thing between her and the open air, and who had just handed it to him not because she forgave him and not because she trusted him, but because she was underneath everything, someone who calculated clearly and acted from that clarity without flinching. He went to the door. "Your attorney," she said behind him, "before you open it." He walked out into the cold. He sat in the car in the driveway of her house, and he held the drive in both hands, and he thought about what she'd said. Someone inside your organization who confirmed what she was pulling out. And the cold moved through the car's fading heat in stages, and outside the garden was dark and still, and above the roofline the city threw its light against the clouds. And somewhere in the floors above him, his children were asleep in rooms their mother had chosen for them and furnished with her own hands. He put the drive in his jacket pocket. He started the car. His phone rang. Jin-ho. He answered. "I found the intermediary," Jin-ho said. His voice had a quality Dante hadn't heard in 11 years of working with him, something stripped of its usual evenness, something that sounded like a man who has just opened a door he expected to find empty. "Park Jae-won. He's a mid-level commercial attorney. I pulled his network. His firm has a relationship with a consulting group that does due diligence for the Hwan network." He paused. "Dante. The referral that sent Vivian to him. The person who recommended Park Jae-won to her as a trustworthy neutral intermediary." The car was idling in the driveway. "It came from Naomi Cross," Jin-ho said. The name sat in the silence like something dropped from a great height. Naomi Cross, the woman who had built Vivian's financial structure, who had recommended Evelyn Brooks, who had been, in Vivian's telling of it, the single most important architect of everything she'd built over 2 years. The brilliant friend who had guided her from nothing to 40 million in the most important preparation of her life. "She didn't know," Dante said. He said it before he could stop himself. "I don't know what she knew," Jin-ho said carefully. "She didn't know." He said it again, harder, because he needed it to be true, and because the alternative, that Vivian had been betrayed not just by the intermediary, but by the woman who'd been closest to her through all of it, who had held her hand through every step, was a thing he didn't have room for right now, couldn't process on top of everything else the night had already put in front of him, and so he said it a third time. "She didn't know." Jin-ho was quiet. "Or she did know," Jin-ho said, "and Vivian is inside something much larger than a divorce." The drive sat in Dante's jacket pocket, warm now from his body heat, and his attorney's number was in his phone, and tomorrow morning there was a meeting with the Hwan network that he was not going to attend, and on the drive was a file his wife had told him not to open until his attorney had read it first. And in the house behind him was the woman who had built everything she had from silence, while he had been dismantling himself from the inside. And the night was cold, and the city was bright, and somewhere in it the Hwan network was waiting to see what Dante Moretti would do when he finally understood the full shape of what he was standing in. He called his attorney. "I need you at my office at 6 in the morning," he said. "Bring anyone you trust completely. We have one night to build something that has to hold by tomorrow afternoon." He backed out of the driveway. The iron gate closed behind him, silent and precise, the way Vivian did everything, and he drove north toward the bridge with the drive in his pocket, and his attorney's voice in his ear, and the specific feeling of a man who has spent a night learning the dimensions of his own catastrophe and has arrived, finally, at the point where understanding it is no longer enough, and the only remaining question is what he is willing to do. The file on the drive was 47 pages long. Dante's attorney, a man named Seo, who had been practicing criminal defense and organizational law for 22 years, and who had, in those years, seen most of what there was to see, read it twice before he said anything. He read it at the conference table in Dante's office at 6:40 in the morning, with 2 other attorneys present and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. And when he finished the second read, he took off his glasses and set them on the table and looked at Dante with the expression of a man who has just been handed something he was not prepared for. "The third party," he said. "Tell me." Seo looked at the other 2 attorneys, then back at Dante. "The documentation names Jin-ho Park as the internal confirming source, The person who verified Selena's pulled intelligence before it went to the Juan network. He paused. According to the file, he's been providing confirmatory information, not the primary intelligence, but authentication of what Selena was pulling, for approximately 8 months. The last confirmed instance was 6 weeks ago. The room was very quiet. Dante sat at the head of the table and did not move. He had been awake since before he'd gotten back to the house. He had not slept. I was operating on the far side of exhaustion, in that specific territory where the body has burned through everything it has and is running on something older and more stubborn, and what he felt right now he could not have named with precision except that it had weight, genuine physical weight, like something had been placed on his sternum and was being pressed in by degrees. 11 years. Jinho had worked for him for 11 years. The documentation, he said. His voice was level. He had decided it would be level before he came into this room, and it was. How solid is it? Extremely. Seo put his glasses back on. Vivian's forensic accountant mapped the confirmation pattern through the timing of 3 specific events: the Inchin interferences and the Jiang withdrawal. Each time, there was a window of 48 to 72 hours between Selena accessing the relevant information and the Huans acting on it. That window is consistent with her passing it to a handler who then verified it through a second source before they moved. He paused. The second source in each instance had access to the same information and had contact with Huan-connected numbers in the same window. That source is Jinho. Dante looked at the table. At the grain of the wood, dark and fine, a table he'd had for 10 years. He thought about Jinho yesterday. The careful voice, the steady professionalism, the way he'd said, "I know," when Dante called Selena's relationship with the Huans a pre-existing recruitment, as if he were confirming a theory. He thought about Jinho finding Park Jae-won last night and delivering that information about the compromised escrow and the name Naomi Cross with exactly the right quality of reluctance, the exact texture of a man discovering something that troubled him. He thought about Vivian saying your attorney needs to see it before you do, so the response is legal and documented. If you see it first, you'll make a decision you won't be able to come back from. She had known what was in the file. She had known what he would want to do when he read it. She had made him promise an attorney first because she understood him well enough to know that without that buffer, he would have gone directly from this table to something irreversible. He pushed back from the table and stood. "I need an hour," he said. Seo nodded. He knew what that meant. He had worked for Dante long enough to know when to ask questions and when to be a lawyer and wait. Dante went to the window. Seoul at 7 in the morning, the sky still dark in the west and beginning to pale in the east. The city in that particular state of early morning when it's most honest about itself, stripped of the performance of daylight. He stood there and he thought about what had to happen in the next several hours, and he thought about the specific mechanics of how Jinho would need to be handled, what would need to be documented, and what would need to be left undocumented. And he thought about 11 years of proximity and access and the particular trust that comes from having shared enough danger with a person that you stop calculating it. He made 2 calls from the window, both brief, both to people who were not in this room and who did not need to be told more than what they were told. Then he went back to the table. "The Huans want a meeting this afternoon," he said. "We're going to give them one." Seo looked at him. "Different terms than they proposed," Dante said. "I want the posture built on the recruitment timeline from Vivian's drive. Selena's pre-existing relationship with the Juan network, predating her involvement with me. We file a private civil complaint today, before the meeting, establishing that the intelligence they obtained through Selena constitutes unlawful commercial interference originating from their own conspiracy." He paused. "We arrive at the meeting holding that filing. They're not leveraging me. I'm informing them of their legal exposure." Seo was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's an aggressive posture." "Yes. They may walk away. They may escalate. They may. But they have the same problem we do, which is that a public escalation exposes them at least as badly as it exposes us. And the documents they have from the compromised escrow, they can't use them without revealing how they obtained them, which puts their own attorney in jeopardy." He paused. "They're bluffing with a hand they can't show. We need to make them understand we know that." Seo looked at the other attorneys. Something passed between them. Professional, rapid, the silent calibration of people who do this for a living. Then Seo said, "Give me 2 hours." Dante nodded. He turned back to the window. Below on the street, a delivery truck was double parked, and a man in a reflective vest was unloading boxes with the methodical efficiency of someone doing a thing they've done 10,000 times. And Dante watched him for a moment because it was something ordinary, and ordinary things were useful right now. He called Vivian at 7:15. She answered immediately, which meant she hadn't slept either. "Naomi Cross," he said. A silence. Brief. "What about her?" "Jinho told me last night that the referral sending you to Park Jae-won came from Naomi. I need to know whether you've spoken to her since." Another silence, longer, with a different quality. The quality of someone rearranging something they thought they understood. "No," she said. "Not since 3 days before I left the house. We spoke about the final asset transfers. She called it clean and clear." A pause. Dante. "You're telling me Naomi was connected to Park Jae-won?" Jinho said the referral came through her. He heard her breathe. A single slow breath, controlled, the kind that costs something. "What else did Jinho tell you last night?" "He identified the intermediary, gave me the Naomi connection." He paused. He was very thorough. The silence on her end told him she was hearing what he wasn't saying, hearing the specific way he'd said thorough and understanding what it meant about what he'd found in the file this morning. "Vivian," he said, "did Naomi know about the escrow? Did she know you were putting documents with Park Jae-won?" A long pause. "Yes," she said quietly. "I told her. She was the one who suggested having a dead man switch. She's the one who suggested the escrow structure." She stopped. "She recommended Park Jae-won to me as a neutral party." The geometry of it settled. Not Jinho confirming Selena's intelligence for the Hwans as an act of individual betrayal. Jinho and Naomi cross as 2 points in a wider configuration, one positioned inside Dante's organization, and one positioned inside Vivian's, both feeding toward the same network, and between them the ability to monitor both sides of the situation simultaneously. When Dante started finding things, Jinho had been there to manage what he found, to shape what reached him, and in what order. When Vivian built her protection, Naomi had been there to ensure the most critical element of it, the dead man's switch, was wired to fail. "She was never on your side," Dante said. He said it as plainly as it needed to be said, because there was no version of this that needed softening. From the beginning, the financial strategy, the attorney referral, the escrow structure, all of it built to look like protection, while making sure the Hwans had eyes on everything you were doing. He heard Vivian exhale. Not a gasp, not a cry. The exhale of a person who has absorbed something enormous and is deciding in real time what to do with the physical fact of it. He thought about what it cost. That exhale. Not him, not the marriage, not any of the things she had already processed and moved through. But this. The woman who had sat with her at the beginning of all of it, who had held the blueprint of everything she was building, who had been the closest thing she had to a safe space in those 2 years of silence, being the fault line through the middle of all of it. $40 million, Vivian said. Her voice was very quiet. All of it real. All of it mine. Yes. The house. Clean. Evelyn Brooks built that structure independently. Naomi didn't have involvement in the final asset placement. Evelyn handled that alone. He paused. What you built is yours. That hasn't changed. Another silence, and in it something shifted. He could feel it shift even through a phone line. Some adjustment in the quality of her breathing, some settling. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Today, I'm going to a meeting with the Hwan Network with a civil filing and a different conversation than the one they planned for." He paused. "After that, there are internal matters to address." She understood internal matters. She didn't ask him to specify. "And Naomi," she said, "that's your decision. She was in your life, not mine." A long pause. "I'll handle it," she said. The words were very flat and very final, the tone of a person closing a door that they know they will not open again. He stood at his office window and looked at the city and thought about all the people who had positioned themselves around the two of them for their own purposes, using the architecture of a failing marriage as a structure to operate inside. And he thought about how thoroughly he had made it easy for them, how completely he had looked away from the things worth watching. "The children," he said. 10 o'clock. I'll still come." Yes, she said. Come at 10. The call ended. The meeting with the Juan Network's representative took place at 2 in the afternoon in a law office in Yowido, which was neutral ground in the specific sense that both parties had attorneys present, and everything said was technically in the context of legal consultation and therefore privileged. The representative was a man named Bayek, 50s, with the composed bearing of someone who manages other people's problems for a living and has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. He had not expected Dante to arrive with a filed civil complaint. SEO placed it on the table between them, 2 copies, and gave Bayek 60 seconds to read the cover page before he began speaking. He explained the predicate offense argument clearly and without drama. He explained the unlawful commercial interference framework. He explained that the documentation Bayek's clients possessed, obtained through a compromised intermediary and therefore tainted, was not leverage but liability, and that deploying it in any form would constitute a further offense that would be immediately and comprehensively responded to. Beck read. His face did very little, which was professional. Then he looked at Dante. Dante looked back at him. You understand, Beck said carefully, that my clients have Your clients have a problem, Dante said. They built it themselves. They recruited Selena Voss 2 years before she had access to anything useful, which means they were running a long-game intelligence operation against my organization. That operation produced the documents they're currently holding. Anything derived from that operation is fruit of their own conspiracy. He paused. Your clients want to negotiate. Here's what I'm willing to negotiate. They return the copies of the escrow documents to the originating party. He didn't say Vivian's name. They cease all contact with Park Jae-won regarding this matter, and they remove themselves from the Southern distribution competition through a territorial agreement that CO will draft by Friday. He paused again. In exchange, I don't file the full civil action, and I don't provide the predicate offense documentation to the relevant investigative authority. Beck looked at him for a long moment. And if my clients decline, then they find out how expensive it is to have built this particular house of cards. He held Beck's eyes. I've had a bad 2 days. I'm not in a mood to be patient. Beck excused himself for 20 minutes. He came back and agreed to 3 of the 4 terms and negotiated on the 4th, and by 4:15 they had a framework that CO called workable and that Dante called sufficient, and that was, in the final accounting, the best available outcome from a situation that had no good ones. It was not a victory. It was the cessation of a specific category of bleeding. There was a difference. The internal matters took the rest of the afternoon. Dante handled them with SEO present and documented, which was what Vivian had asked for and which was also what was necessary. He would not describe what happened in those hours as clean or as satisfying in any way that resembled the word. Jinho sat across from him in the same conference room, and he was, to the end, composed, not apologetic, not defiant, just composed, with the particular stillness of a man who has calculated the probabilities and arrived at the inevitable. He confirmed what the document said. He did not elaborate unnecessarily. He said once, near the end, "It was business, Dante. You know that." Dante looked at him. 11 years, he said. Jinho said nothing. "Business," Dante said. He stood up and left the room and left Seo to handle the documentation and the logistics and everything that followed, because he had been in that room as long as he needed to be, and staying longer would have made him something he was trying not to become. He drove to Gangnam at 5:30. I was an hour and a half late to the 10 o'clock he'd promised, and he had called to say so at noon, and Vivian had said, "Fine, come when you can," and he had come now, in the last of the winter light, through the iron gate that swung open because she had saved his code in the system, which he understood as a practical decision and not as anything more. She met him at the door again. This time she looked different, not dressed differently, not visibly altered in any concrete way, but something in how she was standing, some weight that had been in her posture for as long as he could remember, that was not there now, or was there in a smaller way, diminished by something the day had done. She had been on the phone most of the day, he guessed. Naomi, Evelyn, possibly others he didn't know about. She had been doing what she did, which was handling things, quietly and completely. "They're in the garden," she said. He walked through the house, through the rooms she had furnished with such specific care, and out through the glass doors to the terrace and the garden below it. Mia was on the grass with a ball, kicking it against a low stone wall and catching it when it bounced back, alone in the absorbed way that only children can be alone. Eli was at the terrace's edge in a puffy coat, crouched down, examining something in a planter box with the intense focus of a 5-year-old confronting the mysteries of dirt. Dante stopped on the terrace and looked at them. He didn't call out immediately. He stood there for a moment in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and watched his daughter kick her ball, and his son study his planter box. And he felt something move through him that had the quality of pain without being pain, that ached in the specific location where certainty used to live. Eli looked up, saw him. His face went through the complete and unguarded transformation that only small children's faces do, pure and immediate. And he said, "Daddy," and was on his feet and running across the terrace before Dante had fully processed the word. He caught him. He picked him up and held him and felt the small, solid weight of him against his chest, and he held him longer than he normally would have, long enough that Eli squirmed and said, "You're squeezing." And he loosened his arms, but didn't put him down yet. Mia had stopped kicking the ball. She stood at the edge of the garden looking up at the terrace with her arms at her sides and her face in that watchful arrangement it wore when she was deciding something. Then she walked up to the terrace and stood in front of him and said, "You were supposed to come at 10. I know. I'm sorry. Mama said you had things to deal with." "I did." She looked at him in the direct, assessing way she had, the way that had always made him feel slightly on trial. Then she said, "Are you staying for dinner?" He looked past her at Vivian, who had come to the terrace door and was standing in the frame of it with her arms folded against the cold, watching. She didn't answer for him. She left it where it was. "Not tonight," he said. I'll come back on Saturday. We can do something, whatever you want." Mia considered this with the seriousness of a contract negotiation. "The aquarium," she said. "The aquarium." She nodded, satisfied, and went back for her ball. He put Eli down eventually and spent the next hour in the garden in the cold, pushing Eli on a small swing that had been installed on the lower terrace, listening to Mia narrate an elaborate game she'd invented that involved the ball in the stone wall and a set of rules that kept changing whenever she was losing. He didn't think about the meeting or Jinho or the Juans or the federal inquiry that was still open and would require months of careful management before it was resolved. He thought about none of it. He was in the garden with his children in the cold, and the sky above the city was going from gray to dark, and the lights of Gangnam were coming on below the terrace in their patterns. At some point, Vivian brought out hot chocolate, 2 small mugs for the children, and she stood at the terrace railing with her own coffee, and she looked at the city, and he came to stand near her because the children were occupied and there were things that still needed to be said. "Naomi," he said, "we spoke this afternoon." Her voice was very flat. She didn't deny it. She said, she stopped, looked at her coffee. She said the financial advice was real. The strategy was sound. She said she didn't tell them about the structure itself, only about the documents in escrow. A pause. "She said she thought it would keep me safer, that if the Juans knew I had a dead man switch, they'd leave me alone." "You don't believe that?" "No." A pause. "I believe she made a calculation, and I was part of it, and she told herself a story about it that let her sleep." She looked at the city. "I've known her for 15 years. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. Some losses don't have language yet. They just sit in the chest and wait for time to give them shape. "The financial structure is intact," he said instead, because that was true and she needed to hear it. "Evelyn's work holds, the house, the assets, the trust. None of it was compromised by what Naomi passed on. The Juans had the escrow documents, but they didn't have the structure itself." "I know." She looked at her coffee. "Evelyn called at noon. She's already had the escrow formally dissolved and the original secured under a different mechanism." A pause. "I should have used her for that from the beginning." "You trusted someone you'd trusted for 15 years, he said. "That's not a mistake. That's what trust is." She looked at him, briefly. Something in her expression shifted in a way he couldn't fully read, and then it settled back into that steadiness. "The divorce papers," she said. "Evelyn will send them to SEO next week. We've agreed on the framework." "I know. SEO briefed me." He paused. "Primary custody with you. Visitation on a schedule we'll finalize. The financial separation is clean, where her assets are hers, mine are mine. There are no marital asset claims on either side." He paused. "It's fair." It's accurate, she said. Fair is a different word. He accepted that distinction. He had stopped arguing with her precision. Below them, Eli had abandoned the swing and was back at his planter box. Mia had shifted her game to something that involved counting stones along the garden path and arguing with herself about the rules. The garden was dim now, the terrace lights coming on automatically, and the children moved through the dimness with the particular ease of children who have already decided this is home. He loves the garden, Vivian said. About Eli. She was watching him crouch over his planter box again, endlessly fascinated by whatever was in it. I didn't know he'd be like that. I thought it would be Mia. Mia needs walls, Dante said. Eli needs things that grow. She looked at him, that brief, unguarded look again. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. He stayed another 20 minutes. He said goodbye to the children on the terrace. Eli held onto his hand for longer than was necessary, and then let go all at once, the way small children release things, completely. And Mia reminded him about the aquarium with the tone of someone confirming a contractual obligation, and he said, Saturday, I'll be here at 10, and she said fine. Vivian walked him to the door. They stood in the entry hall, the warm house around them, and she looked at him with the expression he had been watching all evening, that stillness that was no longer what he'd once called passivity and would never call that again. You're going to be all right, he said. He said it not as reassurance, she didn't need reassurance, but as a statement of something he now understood to be true the way few things were true, simply, factually, without decoration. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. The kids are going to be all right. I know that too. He nodded. He put his hand on the door. Dante. She said his name quietly, the way she used to say it a long time ago, before it became the word she used to set boundaries and frame legal realities and hold distance. Just his name, said like a name. For what it's worth, and I don't know what it's worth, you came tonight. He looked at her. You called me, he said, in the car, on the bridge. You could have let it go. Let the Juans move. Let whatever happened, happen. He paused. You called me anyway. She held his eyes. The children have your name, she said. That's not nothing. He opened the door. The cold came in, the night air of January in Seoul, sharp and clean. And beyond the door the garden was dark, and the city was bright, and the iron gate at the end of the driveway stood open because she had left it open when he arrived. He walked out. He heard the door close behind him, soft and final, the sound of a well-made door in a well-made house. He drove home slowly, for the first time in 2 days without urgency. He drove through the lit streets, across the bridge over the Han, north through the city toward the house that was his and that he would have to learn to live in differently, now. He drove without the phone to his ear for once, without Jinho's voice, without the architecture of the organization pressing in from all sides. He drove in the particular quiet of a man who has been through something and is only beginning to understand its full dimensions. The federal inquiry would take 8 months to resolve. SEO was already building the response. The Juan territorial agreement would hold through the spring and be renegotiated by summer, which was the nature of those agreements. The internal damage, Jinho, the operational leaks, the months of intelligence that had moved to the wrong people, would take longer to assess and longer still to repair. There were no clean endings in that world. There were only the next problems, managed or mismanaged, and the decisions you made about what kind of person you were while you managed them. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later, in March, on a Tuesday morning in a Seoul courthouse with Seo and Evelyn Brooks present, and both parties signing in the same room without incident. Vivian wore a gray coat. She signed with the pen she'd brought herself, which Dante noticed and which struck him as completely characteristic. They did not speak directly to each other in the courthouse, but when it was done and they were in the corridor and the attorneys were gathering papers, she looked at him once across the corridor and nodded, barely perceptibly, and he nodded back. The children adjusted the way children adjust when the adults around them are consistent, with difficulty at first, with grief that came in waves, with questions that were sometimes impossible to answer and sometimes answered badly, and then gradually, over months, with the particular resilience of people who are still becoming themselves and haven't yet decided what is and isn't survivable. Mia became, over the following year, increasingly interested in how things were built. Houses, structures, systems. She asked Vivian once how she had bought the mansion, and Vivian told her simply and without drama that she had worked hard and saved and invested carefully. Mia thought about this for a while and then said, "So it was yours all along?" And Vivian said yes. So it was. Eli continued to tend the planter boxes. Margaret Moretti called Vivian once in February to ask about the children. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. At the end of it, she said, "You were good for this family. I want you to know I know that." Vivian said thank you. There was nothing else to say, and the old woman understood that too. One evening in April, when the spring had come and the garden had begun to show what it would become in season, Vivian stood on the south-facing terrace with a glass of wine and the city laid out below her, all of Gangnam lit and vivid and intricate in the way that cities look from above when you are high enough to see the pattern instead of the chaos. She had been on the phone with Evelyn, something routine, and had come out to the terrace after to decompress in the particular quiet of her own outdoor space. Mia came out and stood beside her. They stood together for a while without speaking. The city below them was indifferent and spectacular and full of other people's stories, all of them in progress, none of them visible from up here except as light. "Mama," Mia said. "Yeah." "Did you always know it would work out?" Vivian thought about this. She thought about the hotel receipt in the coat pocket and the silence of that morning and the decision she had made in that silence. She thought about 2 years of early mornings and numbers on screens and the specific loneliness of building something no one can know you're building. She thought about the drive across the river in the rain with the children asleep. She thought about the gate swinging open. "No," she said. "I knew what I was going to do. That's different." Mia considered this. She looked at the city. "What's the difference?" Vivian looked at her daughter, at the sharp, watchful face of her, the coat she had buttoned correctly now, the particular way she held her body that was already and permanently her own. "Knowing what you're going to do," she said, "means you don't have to know how it ends. You just have to keep going." Mia thought about this for a moment. Then she nodded with the gravity of a child storing something for later, and she went back inside. Vivian turned back to the city. The lights ran from the river to the hills and back, all that distance illuminated, all that life in motion, and she stood on her terrace in the spring air, and she breathed. She had left that house in the rain with a suitcase and 2 sleeping children and nothing else, nothing that could be seen. What she had carried that no one saw, what she had built in the long silence of a marriage that had already ended before it ended, what she had walked away from and what she had walked into. None of it had been visible in the rearview mirror, not to him, not to anyone watching. The Mafia boss had looked at his wife and seen a woman with nowhere to go. He had not seen her at all. She finished her wine. She went inside. She turned off the terrace light behind her, and the darkness settled back over the garden, and the city went on below, bright and unfinished and moving, the way things do when the story is over, but the life continues.